Hello and welcome to Great Britain in Focus. I'm James McCullough.
And I'm Alex Cooper.
In this episode, we first join Kevin Turley interviewing Bishop Alan Hopes of East Anglia Diocese.
And we then join Joanna Bogle and James McCullough in Norwich, exploring medieval saints and their message for us today.
So we start by joining Kevin Turley as he interviews Bishop Alan Hopes of East Anglia Diocese, which incidentally is the same diocese for us here in Walsingham. They discuss challenges facing the diocese and for those of the UK as a whole.
And some of the challenges he picks up on are the secularisation within the church, but also lack of faith formation in society at large. However, Bishop Alan is also really hopeful about the evangelisation of the young and the church catching up with the digital age.
It sounds like a great interview, so let's see it.
Hello and welcome to EWTN Studios in Walsingham, where we have a very special guest. We have our own bishop. Bishop Alan Hopes is the Bishop of East Anglia and has been since 2013. Bishop Alan, welcome to EWTN Studios here in Walsingham.
Thank you very much.
What is the biggest challenge facing the church in Britain today?
Well, I think the biggest one is secularism, that the population has turned against organised religion. God still seems to figure quite a lot in their lives. The other problem, I think, is that many secularists have gone into other odd religions. So paganism, witchcraft, rather than going for anything that is mainline. I think, so the problem for the church is to really get its message out into the marketplace, because the marketplace is clamouring with different voices. So many voices telling people what they should think, what they should do. It's not just the other religions or the secularist world, but also the many ideologies that are now being set up, that are the new truths of this generation, really. They're the new orthodoxies. You can't deny them. You can't stand from them. So how do we get the voice across? And the church, I think, just has to be very brave indeed to begin to move into that marketplace. I always remember Pope Benedict, when he came to England, just said that we need to be out there with our voice. And he spoke about the two things, like faith and reason, that have to moderate each other. Religion without reason goes off the rails, and reason without religion, without faith, goes off the rails as well, as we've seen in all the different totalitarian regimes and so on of the past century.
Would you say, I mean, it's interesting you use the word marketplace there, because it brings to mind this sort of environment in which the first apostles, especially St. Paul, were proclaiming their message. I mean, I'm beginning to wonder, is there anything really new in this, that we are, we've gone into an age which has gone through Christianity and come out the other end, but is it just a return to the past, in a sense, of where the church started?
It is, except that, of course, in Paul's world, religion was something that was very, very important everywhere. Everybody had their own god and gods. And of course, whereas St. Paul just had the altar to the unknown God, just in case they'd missed anybody out, the altar to the unknown God in our present day is vast, because it's just there is nowhere where that altar can stand and people would understand what you were talking about. So I think it's a very complicated modern life that we have to try and promote the gospel message in.
St. Paul and the first apostles had novelty, I guess. You and your confreres don't have novelty.
No.
But one of the things, I don't know if you've noticed this, is that there's a whole generation, especially young generation, that really have never really been, not only never been catechized, but they don't even have the fundamentals of Christianity. Is that an opportunity, would you say?
I think it is a huge opportunity, and I think we need to be there to keep talking about the message. You talk about young people, children, and you're quite right, because the essentials of the scripture stories, for instance, where we come from, are just not taught anymore in the state schools. So they haven't even got any idea of this. Number of people now who come to funerals who can't even pray the Our Father because they don't know it. I talk about funerals and weddings because those are the two places that the secular society comes to.
And baptism.
And baptisms.
Yeah.
Well, and baptisms, yes.
In your long Christian experience, in your priestly experience as a bishop, I mean, there's an element of the modern secularism which is essentially empty.
Yeah.
And again, is that an opportunity?
Yes, we've got the opportunity to fill it with something because it's a space. I think in today's society, people are looking for happiness, for contentment, for fulfillment. Where do they look? They look to this experience, that experience, the next experience. But the trouble is it doesn't fulfill them because, when that happiness disappears, you go on to the next one and so on. Whereas, I can quote St. Augustine, I think, when he says, our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. And I think that's what we as a church have to try and do, to help people to encounter God, to encounter Jesus Christ, and they will find that rest they're looking for.
Bishop, that's a good summary of what the problem is. My second question to you is, of all the gamut of things available to the church, to priests, to bishops, what would be the one thing you would single out as an aid to moving the church forward, to countering this void in society?
Can I mention two?
Of course.
So I think the first one must be prayer. We have to go back again and again to God and get our strength and remember that whatever our mission is, it comes from Him, it doesn't come from us. So we have to find out what His will is for us as a church, as a diocese, as parishes and so on, in order to go out and start again, as it were.
Any particular form of prayer you would recommend?
Well, I've tried to promote adoration.
Yes.
And I think certainly for young people, this is a wonderful time of prayer. We have a big parish in Cambridge, right at the heart of it, in the centre, where all the students walk past to go to the railway station or back from the railway station to go to their lodgings. And every so often they have night fever.
Yes.
And there are people there that go out and invite people to come in and pray. And it's an extraordinary phenomenon that young people will come in and pray and light a candle and spend time. So I think adoration certainly must be the key to the new evangelization. I mentioned that because I think that's key to how we promote the gospel again. Yeah.
And you had two things. That's one.
The second thing is, I think, when you raise catechesis, people raise their eyes. But catechesis is really promoting the gospel and the teaching of the church, but to do it in such a way that people don't feel they're being catechized, and they suddenly feel, gosh, this is something beautiful that we've never heard before. Because actually the teaching of the church is about us as human beings. It helps us to rediscover our purpose who we are, and so on. So that teaching about the gospel has got to be done positively and with encouragement.
We're living in an age which you and I both come from a pre-internet age.
Yeah.
We're now living in this kind of digital age.
Yeah.
The catechesis, I guess, has to catch up with that. Would you?
I'm a bit of a dinosaur when it comes to the digital age, but I can see that we can use it to promote the gospel. The Pope uses it to promote the gospel, and I think we all ought to be able to use it to bring the gospel home to our young people.
Well, I guess you're using it today, aren't you?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I think my third point would be, particularly with young people, I think the issues that lie around us, such as poverty, injustice, and homelessness and hunger and so on, all these things are things that we can energize our young people to think, gosh, the church is actually involved in these ways. And I think they need to have a sense of purpose, and that purpose of promoting the well-being of another human being is always important for young people. We can see that, in all sorts of things like the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme. And I think Pope Francis has brought that home to us, that we have to be the church which is outgoing towards those who are in need. And I think we're taking that on board much more.
Bishop Allen, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I'm particularly excited about our next segment because, James, you headed over to Norwich to explore the lives of two English medieval saints.
Yes, indeed. Joanna Bogle and I discussed the lives of Edmund of Abingdon and Richard of Chichester, both of whom lived at around the time of the early 13th century, a time at the end of the Norman period when the church was facing issues not too dissimilar to today. So we talk about the impact that these people had on the relationship between church and state, and also the messages that they could give us for today.
Let's head over to Norwich and find out.
Welcome back to our History of Christianity series. We're now in the Middle Medieval period. This is a time when the saints were the superheroes, the celebrities of their day. This is a time when saints were written about in hagiographies. People accessed these writings, they emulated the saints. So we're going to start with
Edmund of Abingdon.
Edmund lived in around the end of the 12th century, beginning of the 13th century.
Yes, what is interesting is that he was born only about 100 years after the Norman conquest. That places him in history.
Right.
And let's get him right, which Edmund we're talking about.
Okay.
This is not the boy King Edmund, the Saxon king in East Anglia, who was martyred under the pagan Vikings. And this is not our beloved Edmund Campion, who perished defending their faith under Elizabeth I. This is Edmund of Abingdon, although we could call him Edmund of Canterbury only in the sense that he became Archbishop of Canterbury, as we'll be hearing as we go along.
Right, so he was born in 1197 in Abingdon. He was born Edmund Rich. We know he attended the grammar school in Oxford, so he must have been from quite a wealthy background. It was at this point then, after Oxford and grammar school, he studied in Paris, and I believe he picked up some of the teachings of Aquinas, because he goes to study in Oxford and eventually teaches in Oxford. He's one of the first people he teaches us about the philosophy of Aristotle.
Yes, this was new at the time, this discovery of Aristotle through, if you like, the message and the lens of Aquinas. And he is an Oxford boy, even in his boyhood. And yes, he must have been quite well-to-do, because the name Rich, which he doesn't seem to have used as a surname, but was almost a nickname, their family were moderately well-to-do. And so he was a man of Oxford, a man of great learning. And as far as we know, that's roughly what he wanted to be. There was no particular political or other ambition. This makes him rather a pleasing character. Not all bishops in history at any time have been completely free of ambition, but I think he was. I think he was a real scholar. I think he would have been very happy teaching Aristotle and all of that at Oxford, drawing on what he'd known from Paris, and with that very rich discovery of new learning which the true scholar loves. No, I think there's a lot to Edmund. I think he was a peaceful, scholarly, decent man who didn't really want to become Archbishop of Canterbury.
So, at Oxford, he's happily teaching, but then he's called to be the canon of Salisbury Cathedral. And it was at this stage that it was an important role. He became under the influence of Stephen Langton, the current Archbishop of Canterbury, quite an outspoken archbishop.
I always think of Stephen Langton as almost being the last of the sort of Normanish bishops, the strong, powerful, organising. And yes, because of his influence, Edmund of Abingdon becomes Archbishop of Canterbury.
Right.
Not at a happy time. Things are very difficult. Isn't it funny how often in these programmes we're saying things were not very easy? It's almost a lesson to us when we think of the modern era.
Exactly.
Nothing changes really. So you have the king, he's Henry III at this point, not behaving very well, and big rows with the barons.
Troubled times, indeed. It was the barons who were causing the trouble. This is the start of the clash between the barons and Henry III and subsequent monarchs. So the barons actually rebelled. This was centred mostly in the West Country. It was along the borders with Wales. Even before Edmund was consecrated as Archbishop, he went down to that area and he started to mediate. He really got to know the barons well. He affiliated himself with the barons and he mediated truces. And he stayed around to make sure that those truces held. So he became the peacemaker that the Pope had originally wanted him to be.
This doesn't make him very popular with the king, of course, so you go on having a tension there. There's quite a lot of personal courage in all of this.
Absolutely.
Is there something in this discussion, this getting a truce with the barons, is there something in the beginning of our stirrings of our current parliamentary system somehow in this? It's not just the rule by the monarch and his chosen few, but the few coming into a clash with the monarch and reaching some kind of relationship where they have to, well, to use the Norman word, to parley. There will be a real parliament, and it's not just a gathering of people, but it's men who will stand up to the king, but there has to be a mediation. Yeah.
It's interesting you bring in the French connection here, because I believe that Henry III had strong links with France, because it seemed that the barons' main complaint of Henry was that he was being not English enough, not upholding English laws. And this was actually where the barons were representing the people in this argument. So really, Edmund came in on this argument as a way more politically rather than spiritually. He was a political mediator. And this was an interesting mission for him as Archbishop.
He had to persuade the king to uphold English laws.
Yeah.
He had to call the king to his duty to uphold English laws. Not an easy job for an academic, but at least he would know what he was talking about.
Sure.
And since he'd got the barons sort of on side, and he carries his own authority, and he talks to the king about the king's duty, still not going to make you very popular with the king, though, is it?
True.
Takes quite a lot of courage to do that one.
So the clash continues, and there are times when the truces need to be remade, they break down. Edmund comes in each time, reforms the truce, mediates, and peace ensues. But this situation can't last forever. Henry III at this point brings in a French advisor, Desroches, and this person has a very bad influence on the whole situation. It makes it inflamed. The barons demand that Henry
deposes and sends back to France Desroches. Under pain of excommunication, Edmund persuades or forces Henry to get rid of Desroches. Desroches goes back to France. Peace ensues. Great news. But what happens now is that Henry applies to the Pope for a legate to be sent, a papal legate to be sent to England to try and undermine Edmund. Now, of course, the Pope isn't aware of this, but a legate is sent. Otho is his name. Otho comes into an argument which has just started between Henry III and the barons. Edmund wades in to defend the barons, and Otho, in his silence, undermines and doesn't support Edmund. This really causes a bit of a fracas. We find Edmund now going to Rome to seek the help of the Pope, to petition the Pope for support against Henry III. On the way, he stops in France because he falls ill, tragically ill, and he dies.
This is an extraordinary story because one of the people with him, one of the people who's at his side as he dies, in this really very tragic ending, but in its own way a noble one, is one Richard Witch. Richard Witch from Droitwich, who we will come to meet again because he becomes a bishop in his time. And we know him as Richard of Chichester. And that's the next chapter of our story.
Right.
A rather tragic thing, but after he died, of course, people started to venerate Edmund of Abingdon. They went to his grave, there were miracles, and so the story goes on. And he's a venerated saint. Their prayers go up, and
yeah. And in France, he's very venerated by people in France where he died.
Of course,
and there were many
yes.
miracles attached to his corpse and his grave.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
And here he is influencing the next saint that we'll be exploring, whose own ideas and reforming zeal for the clergy and so on open up another very important chapter.
Right.
So on to Richard of Chichester.
So Richard was born in Droitwich in Worcestershire in 1197. And initially they were quite wealthy, but they fell on hard times when his parents died, so he was orphaned quite early on. And he became a farmhand on the family's estates. So he came down in station quite a bit in his early life. He always wanted to be a scholar, and he was destined, however, for marriage, and they found him a wealthy heiress to marry. He declined this and actually encouraged his brother to marry the heiress. He went off to Oxford to study instead. And, interestingly, in amongst his teachers was Edmund of Abingdon.
So that's how the story fits together.
Yes.
And he does become a scholar. Who wouldn't, under the very clearly excellent teaching of Edmund of Abingdon? And in turn, Richard Witch, Droitwich, his surname became Witch, went to Paris and to Bologna and taught there. And then returns to England. By now he's something of an expert in canon law.
Right.
And it seems it's about this time that he's ordained. It's not quite clear, but he certainly was ordained.
And he's teaching at Oxford at this stage.
Yes.
Right.
And is, I think, a canon lawyer of considerable use to Edmund of Abingdon
I see, yes.
and to others. He is a canon lawyer expert. So we take him there, academic, but also a teaching academic, one who can communicate very well to others, but legalistic too, really knows his stuff. And it's with that background that he is appointed in 1244 as Bishop of Chichester.
Right.
And we know him as Richard of Chichester. And perhaps because the name goes so well, that's how he's become extremely well known. Not all the saints are known by the see, the diocese of which they preside over, but he was Richard of Chichester. And he becomes something of a reforming bishop, which is very interesting and very necessary for those days.
And that's what marks him out, isn't it? Is that there were two things about his life, I think, which stand out. One of which is that, like Edmund, he sort of took a mediating role between the barons and the monarch at the time. There was still this continuing sort of hassle between these two parties, and he was there to try and make the peace and to try and take the side of the church as well, to uphold the principles of the church against the monarch when the monarch infringed upon those principles. So he was defending the church. He was also a man of great asceticism. So what's very interesting is that all the bishops of this time were expected, in a way, to live very grand lives. Luxury, big palaces, very beautiful vestments and clothes, wonderfully rich food. He, in contrast, completely shunned that lifestyle. And he took on this very sort of ascetic way of life.
It's very interesting that it is the reformer bishop who really changes things, calls the priest to a higher standard. He also insisted, of course, that they be celibate and live celibate lives.
Yes.
He insisted the Mass be celebrated properly, no mumbling. He was very clear. It must be enunciated clearly. And we can see in this something which echoes through the church again and again. It's as if the church always has to keep reforming. And they had to remember the sanctity of what they were doing and the things with which they were doing it, back to the golden chalice and so on. So his own life echoed that, and he taught his clergy. He seems to have been much loved. I think people admired him because they knew he wasn't being the grand bishop, but the truly humble one. And this was at a time when this church-state linkage didn't always serve the church very well at all. There was, and it was going to cause more and more problems as the years went by. So there was a tangle in people's minds between church and state that really didn't serve the church at all well.
There was the church and state issue. There was also, maybe what we're drawing to here, is that there was some fall in the standards of the clergy.
Yes.
There was, I think, it seems it's quite clear now that there were fallen standards. There was maybe a little bit of corruption going on. There was maybe by the clergy being a little bit lax in what they were doing.
And people really had to put up with what they'd got. There was this feeling everybody is Catholic, that's the whole deal. And so this would simmer, really. And we get this from other contemporary writings. There's certainly a sort of almost joke sometimes about the way the clergy were, the way you sort of assumed they would be. It didn't work well. And as we progress on from there, so we lead on to the next things that happen in the next centuries, all of which has marked our understanding in Britain of the church and of the clergy, enlivened by saints. This is what is so interesting. It's not the politicians. The kings, of course, we mark our history by the reigns, the dynasties, yes. But in terms of the church and in the life of the nation, it's actually written by saints. And I think this is something we don't always get. We always think of them as plaster characters stuck on at random points of history. But in another sense, they shape history.
Thank you for joining us. Full versions of these interviews will be made available on our social media channels soon.
EWTN-GB is entirely self-funding, and we rely on your generous support to keep great UK content going. If you would like to help out, head over to ewtn.co.uk and hit the donate button.
We look forward to joining you again soon. Take care and God bless.